Once a respected deputy in the notorious Dodge City, JJ Webb would eventually become as well known for his jailbreaks as for the men he put into jail. On the American frontier, the line between lawman and outlaw could be thin, and perhaps no character of the Wild West epitomized that more than John Joshua Webb. And if you don't recognize his name, you might well recognize the name of some of his friends and compatriots like Bat Masterson and Doc Holliday and Dirty Dave Rudabaugh and Wyatt Earp. John Joshua JJ Webb was, the website officer.com explains, the seventh of 12 children of William Webb Jr. and Innocent Blue Brown Webb, born on February 14, 1847 in Keokuk County, Iowa. His family apparently moved around, and he continued drifting after settling out on his own in 1871. Kathy Alexander, editor of the webpage Legends of America, writes that Webb traveled west in 1871, becoming a buffalo hunter and then a surveyor in Colorado. He then drifted from Deadwood, South Dakota to Cheyenne, Wyoming to Dodge City, Kansas. She notes that the 1875 census lists Webb as a teamster living in Ford County, where Dodge City was the county seat. Dodge was located along the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad, and thus served first as a shipping center for buffalo hides and then as the end of the cattle trail from Texas. This attracted often rambunctious visitors and gave the town a reputation for violence. Smithsonian Magazine writes that a joke circulated among Kansas weeklies. A gentleman wishing to go from Wichita to Dodge City appealed to a friend for a letter of introduction. He was handed a double-barrel shotgun and a Colt revolver. But Smithsonian asserts that the town's reputation for violence and lawlessness has generally been overstated, noting that from August 1873 through 1875, apparently no violent deaths occurred. The dramatic shift, given that the town had been the site of 18 murders between 1872 and 1873, can largely be attributed to the establishment of law enforcement in the community. In 1873, Charlie Bassett was elected as the first sheriff of Ford County. Bassett would work with a number of well-known lawmen in Dodge City, including Wyatt Earp, but also notably brothers Edward Ed and Bartholomew Bat Masterson. Bat served as Bassett's undersheriff, while his older brother Ed was the town marshal of Dodge City. It isn't clear when J.J. Webb became involved in law enforcement in Ford County, but a September 29, 1877 edition of the Dodge City Times reported that Webb accompanied Sheriff Bassett and Bat Masterson in pursuit of train robbers. The robbers were the gang of the infamous Sam Bass, who had robbed a Union Pacific train in Nebraska of $60,000. While they chased down rumors of where the gang might cross the AT&SF rail line, they apparently never encountered the robbers. In February of 1878, Webb was part of a posse with Bat Masterson, chasing a trio of men who had attempted to rob a train near Kinsley, Kansas. A February 5th, 1878 edition of the Dodge City Globe writes that the posse had gotten ahead of the would-be train robbers. After some hours waiting, two horsemen cautiously approached from the northeast, their motions indicating their fear of coming up. Mr. Webb, with concealed revolver, went out to meet them. After some talk, they came within shooting distance when Masterson, springing out with loaded rifle, sang out his well-known, "Throw up your hands!" Outlaw Ed West at once complied, but the second outlaw, Dirty Dave Rudabaugh, reached for his revolver. The click of Webb's gun at close quarters changed his mind, the paper reported. Rudabaugh turned on his friends, testifying against him at trial and earning a quick release. Ed Masterson died in the line of duty in April 1878, and Charlie Bassett became the Dodge City town marshal. A June 8, 1878 edition of the Dodge City Times lists Bassett's salary as $100 a month. His assistant marshal, Wyatt Earp, earned $75. J.J. Webb is listed as a special police with a salary of $7.50. The same paper has an advertisement for one J.H. Holliday, dentist. Wyatt Earp had met James Henry Doc Holliday in Fort Griffin, Texas in 1877, when under a commission as a temporary U.S. Marshal, Earp was pursuing a man who had robbed a Santa Fe Railroad construction camp. Earp arrived too late to catch the robber, but did strike up a friendship with Holliday, who had played cards with the man the night before Earp arrived. Coincidentally, the man that Earp was pursuing was Dave Rudabaugh. Holliday then moved to Dodge City, where he would also befriend J.J. Webb. In 1879, a conflict arose in Colorado between the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad and the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad over the rail route through Royal Gorge in Colorado. The right-of-way was being argued in court, but crews from both railroads were subject to occasional violence from the other side. As the violence escalated, both sides started hiring armed men to protect the workers in their camps. The AT and SF hired Bat Masterson, then Ford County Sheriff, to create a posse to protect their work camps, and Webb became part of the group. Strangely, the group also included Dave Rudabaugh. The Ford County Globe reported in May 1879 that Deputy Sheriff Webb has charge of a posse of men employed by the AT and SF Road to guard workmen from attacks by the hostile forces of the Denver and Rio Grande Road. The paper quoted Webb that they have done no fighting yet, but the difficulties between the two roads are by no means settled. As part of the conflict, Webb was briefly made a member of the Pueblo, Colorado police force. The Colorado Railroad War ended without significant bloodshed, but many of the men from Dodge City apparently decided to relocate for new opportunities. Las Vegas, New Mexico, at the edge of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, had been founded in 1835, but by 1879 the town had boomed after the AT&SF built a line through. Alexander writes in Legends of America, when the Iron Horse finally arrived on July 4th, 1879, hundreds of citizens gathered around, including merchants, professionals, desperados, and dance hall girls. Overnight, a new town was born on the east banks of the Galinas River. At first, a settlement of tents, sheds, and makeshift shelters were built, but within just a few short years, many permanent buildings in a competing commercial district had been established. At that time, the town became so large that it rivaled Denver, Tucson, and El Paso in size. The September 30th, 1879 edition of the Dodge City Globe included a letter to the editor describing the town and its famous hot springs. The author, who only signed the letter with the name Artist, writes that Dodge City is well represented here. N.F. Kelly, Henry Shearer, Dr. Milligan, JJ Webb, Wyatt Earp, and many others are here. The same correspondent reported in October that Charlie Bassett and Bat Masterson and a half-score of other Dodgeites had relocated there. We begin to think, he writes, that all of Dodge was moving west. Also, there was Doc Holliday, who opened a saloon. By some accounts, Webb was his partner in the saloon, but in any case, Gary L. Roberts, author of Doc Holliday, The Life and Legend, told True West magazine that Holliday's saloon was one of Webb's hangouts when Doc was running the place in 1879, before his departure to Prescott in company with Wyatt Earp and other members of the Earp family. It is safe to say they knew each other well and were on friendly terms. Holliday was forced to leave after shooting a man named Mike Gordon in a dispute. While many of the Dodgeites moved along, some saw opportunity. The boom part of the boomtown also had brought others along. Alexander writes, before long, outlaws, bunco artists, murderers, and thieves were becoming so common that the eastern part of the settlement had become utterly lawless. Though not as well known as other Wild West towns such as Dodge City, Deadwood, or Tombstone, Las Vegas is said to have been the worst of the Old West. The town would find law and order of a sort under the leadership of a Missourian named Hyman Neal, who went under the odd nickname Hoodoo Brown. Alexander writes, in 1879, supported by other recent immigrants to the town, he was elected as Justice of the Peace for East Las Vegas. Brown put together a police force made of gunfighters, so many of whom had come from Dodge City that the group was known as the Dodge City Gang. Alexander writes these new peace officers, called the Dodge City Gang, began to police new arrivals on the railroad. However, the members were as lawless as those they policed. The gang included Webb, but also Dave Rudabaugh, Dave Mather, known as Mysterious Dave, who had also been a deputy in Dodge City, and a cast of comically Wild West nicknamed hombres, including Slapjack Bill Nicholson and John Bullshit Jack Pierce. The gang allegedly participated in numerous crimes, but were able to be successful. Hoodoo Brown was not only Justice of the Peace, he was also the coroner. Dave Mather was a deputy U.S. Marshal, and Webb was the Las Vegas City Marshal. Alexander writes that while Rudabaugh and the rest committed acts of thievery, Neal, Mather, and JJ Webb, in their official capacities, helped to cover the outlaws' tracks. The gang was suspected in a number of stagecoach robberies and other crimes. Alexander writes that while none of these crimes were laid at the door of JJ Webb, as an associate of the Dodge City gang, his complicity in the matters was widely suspected. But the reign of the Dodge City gang did not last long, as citizens began to be fed up with the lawlessness. On March 2nd, 1880, Webb killed a man named Michael Killaher. Killaher was carrying a gun, which was prohibited, and Webb was trying to disarm him. There is much controversy over the course of events, but Webb shot Kelleher twice in the chest and once in the head. The Las Vegas, New Mexico Daily Gazette reported that Webb told the coroner's jury, "I told him to throw up his hands, that I wanted his gun. He jumped back, put his hand on his pistol and said, 'I won't be disarmed. Everything goes.' I then shot him twice. He fell." While other testimony supported his story, other witnesses disagreed, some claiming that he had shot Kelleher immediately. But Hoodoo was the coroner and controlled the inquiry, and the coroner's jury concluded that JJ Webb, then and there being a peace officer and in the discharge of his duties as such a peace officer, and that said killing was justifiable and absolutely necessary under the circumstances. That might have been the end of it, except that Hoodoo Brown took a step too far. New Mexico historian Don Bullis writes in the New Mexico Stockman and Livestock Digest, "Then Hoodoo made a mistake. He went to Charles Blanchard, the probate judge, and asked to be appointed the administrator of Kelleher's estate. Blanchard was a bit reluctant and soon learned that the $1,000 Brown reported that he took from Kelleher's body was somewhat less than the total amount reportedly there. Since the grand jury was in session in West Las Vegas, at Blanchard's request, it looked into the entire matter. Very shortly, warrants were issued for JJ Webb, charging first-degree murder, and H.G. Neal, a.k.a. Hoodoo Brown, charging larceny. Sheriff's deputies arrested Webb on March 5th, but there was no trace of Hoodoo Brown in East Las Vegas or anywhere else in New Mexico. The rule of the Dodge City gang was over. It seems that Kelleher had been known to be carrying a great deal of cash, and the suspicion was that the shooting was a setup to steal that cash. Suddenly, Hoodoo Brown was gone, and Webb stood trial for murder. There's still disagreement on whether because the evidence didn't support self-defense or merely because of exasperation with the Dodge City gang, but Webb was convicted and sentenced to hang. The Santa Fe Weekly New Mexican wrote, "Great excitement prevails here in town over the sentence, many approving of it, and many thinking it cruel and unjust. Webb appears haggard and 10 years older than he was a week ago." Friends from Dodge City, including Bat Masterson, sent a petition asking the territory governor for leniency, and lawyers sought to appeal for a new trial. While various appeals worked their way through the courts, he remained in the Las Vegas jail. On April 2nd, Dave Rudabaugh and another member of the gang, former Dodge City Deputy John Allen, came to the jail. They pulled a gun on the jailer and demanded the keys. The Hayes, Kansas City Sentinel writes that a fight ensued in which the jailer was shot and killed while defending his prisoner. The Dodge City Globes write that the noise of the shot having brought all the guards to the scene, the two men got scared and left before accomplishing their mission. Not only had the sloppy attempt to free Webb failed, but Webb was in even greater danger. The Globe wrote, "The jailer was a Mexican named Antonio Lino and was very popular among all classes of citizens. The Mexicans threatened to lynch Webb in retaliation for the murder of the jailer. A strong guard had to be placed around the jail for fear that Webb would be lynched." But apparently not strong enough. On November 11th, the Las Vegas Gazette reported that the quiet of Las Vegas was disturbed yesterday morning by the report that there had been a wholesale jail delivery and that 6 prisoners had flown. Apparently, the prisoners had managed to get a hold of some telegraph wire and had, in the night, picked the locks on their cell. JJ Webb was among those who escaped, as was John Allen, who had been part of the Jailbreak attempt in March and had since been arrested for another murder. But Webb was recaptured a month later by Sheriff Pat Garrett. Ironically, the Dodge City Globe wrote, "It appears that the party was not looking for Webb, but were scouring the country in search of the whereabouts of Rudabaugh and his notorious gang, whose depredations had been of the darkest and boldest type." Rudabaugh fled south, where he joined with a gang called the Rustlers, among whose members and purported leader was one William Bonney. Bonney was no stranger to Las Vegas. In fact, his famous nickname, Billy the Kid, was coined by the Las Vegas Gazette. Bonney had been in Las Vegas while Webb was there, although there is no evidence that they had met. However, he and Rudabaugh were together on December 23rd, 1880, when Pat Garrett ran the gang down and captured both Billy and Rudabaugh at a place called Stinking Springs. Billy would be sent to Lincoln County Jail, where his legend would continue, but Rudabaugh was sent to Las Vegas to face trial for the murder of Antonio Lino. On September 20th, 1881, the Las Vegas Gazette reported yet another attempt to escape. Somehow the prisoners had acquired a gun and, picking the locks of their cell, attacked the guards in an attempt to escape. The Gazette described the guards' defense as an heroic one. One of the prisoners, Thomas Duffy, was killed in the shootout, and the prisoners were forced back into their cell. Webb was one of 4 men in the cell, but denied taking part in the escape attempt. By December, Rudabaugh had been sentenced to death for the murder of Leno, and Webb's sentence had been commuted to life in prison by New Mexico Governor Lew Wallace. Alexander writes, Webb, facing life in prison, and Rudabaugh, the threat of hanging, were determined. On December 7th, 1881, they finally succeeded. The prisoners had managed to chip a stone free in the jail wall, and 7 prisoners escaped through the 7-inch by 19-inch hole. There were varying reports as to what had happened to JJ Webb and Dirty Dave Rudabaugh. One report said the two had returned together to Dodge City. Another said that they had started a new gang that was led by Webb, and still another said that the two had parted ways. In fact, Dave Rudabaugh had migrated to Tombstone, Arizona, where he joined the Cowboys in their conflict with the Earp brothers. Purportedly, he might even have participated in the murder of Morgan Earp. He eventually escaped to Mexico, and his death there in February of 1883 is described in another episode of The History Guy. As for J.J. Webb, it wasn't clear what had happened to him until a letter arrived at the Dodge City Times in April 1882. The note from J.A. Scott said that Webb had moved to Winslow, Arkansas, and was living under the name Sam King. He'd worked as a teamster, but died of smallpox on April 12th, 142 years ago, today. The note finished, "You can tell the friends of his death." John Joshua Webb's name seems to be largely forgotten today, which is odd because his jailbreaks alone would seem to merit attention. He was perhaps the epitome of the Wild West gunslinger who was both lawman and outlaw. He was friends with men whose names are legendary and sat at the very center of some of the most famous stories of the Wild West. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.